I raised her. I buried her mother. I walked her down the aisle. And then, 14 years after she handed me her daughter and drove away without looking back, she had the nerve to call me a criminal. My name is Walter. I am 67 years old. I live in a small house on the outskirts of Lethbridge, Alberta. The same house I have lived in for 31 years. The same house where my wife Margaret passed. The same house where I taught my daughter Renee to ride a bike on the gravel driveway out front. It is not a grand house, but it has always been full. The morning Renee left, I remember the frost on the kitchen window. It was late October. My granddaughter Sophie was 3 years old and asleep upstairs. Renee sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking, and she said, "Dad, I just need a few months to get myself together. I can't do this right now." I asked her what this meant. She didn't answer. I asked her where she was going. She said south. That was it. South. I told her Sophie was going to wake up in an hour and ask for her mother. I told her she needed to at least say goodbye to her own child. Renee stood up, set the mug in the sink, pulled her coat off the hook by the door and said, "She's better off with you right now." The door closed. I stood in my kitchen listening to her car back out of the driveway. I stood there for a long time. Sophie woke up at 7:15 and came downstairs in her pajamas with the little polar bear on the front. She looked at me and said, "Where's Mama?" I told her Mama had to go on a trip, that she would be back soon. I believed it when I said it. I did not know that soon was going to mean 14 years. Renee called twice in the first month. Short calls, distracted, like she was checking a box. After that, silence. I tried her number so many times the voicemail stopped accepting messages. I reached out to her friend from high school, a woman named Bev, who had always been kind to me. Bev told me, gently, that Renee had gotten involved with someone and that she wasn't in a good place. I asked if Sophie was in danger. Bev said she didn't think so. I asked if Renee was coming back. Bev was quiet for a moment. Then she said she honestly didn't know. I enrolled Sophie in daycare that January. The woman at the front desk asked for the child's legal guardian information and I paused. Because I had none. No custody agreement. No power attorney. No signed anything. Renee had simply driven away and left me with a 3-year-old and a diaper bag. I told the woman I was Sophie's grandfather, that her mother had left her in my care, and that I was working on the paperwork. I was not working on the paperwork. I didn't know what paperwork existed. A colleague at the hardware store where I worked. I managed the floor for 18 years, had a son who was a family lawyer. His name was Hugh. Hugh spent 40 minutes on the phone with me, explaining what I needed to do. I applied for what they call kinship care in Alberta. Child and Family Services came to my house, looked around, interviewed me, and ultimately gave me legal guardianship of Sophie. It took 4 months and cost me money I didn't have at the time. But it was done. Sophie was mine, legally and in every other way. I spent 34 years in construction management. And the one thing this industry is to view. I packed her lunches. I learned how to braid hair from a YouTube video. Badly at first, then well enough that her teachers complimented it. I sat through every school concert, every parent-teacher meeting, every science fair where her project placed second because the kid with the volcano always wins. I drove her to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years because she loved it and I refused to let her miss it. I took her to Drumheller when she was 9 because she was obsessed with dinosaurs for an entire year. I spent 34 years in construction management. And the one thing this industry thinks is industry hero. I did them because I loved her. Because she was my granddaughter and she needed someone to show up and I was there. When Sophie was 12, she asked me directly about her mother. We were sitting on the back step after dinner. And she just came out with it, calm, like she'd been carrying the question for a while. She said, "Grandpa, is my mom ever coming back?" I told her the truth as gently as I could. That her mother had struggled. That I believed in my heart that Renee loved her. That sometimes people get lost in ways that are hard to explain. Sophie looked out at the yard for a minute and then said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. And then she went back inside to do homework. I went inside and cried in the bathroom with the tap running so she wouldn't hear me. Sophie was 17 when everything changed. It was a Tuesday in March. I was at the kitchen table going through receipts. I do our taxes myself, always have, when I heard a knock at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My neighbor Art sometimes dropped by, but he usually just walked in. I went to the door and opened it. A woman stood on my step. It took me a full 3 seconds to recognize her. Renee. She was 41 years old and she looked it, though not badly. She was dressed well. Her hair was shorter. She was standing next to a man in a dark coat who said nothing and looked at the middle distance the way lawyers do when they're being paid to be present. I said her name. She said, "Hi, Dad." Like no time had passed. Like she'd been at the grocery store. I asked her what she was doing here. She said she had come for Sophie. I want you to understand what it felt like to hear those words. Sophie was upstairs. She was 17 years old. She had a hockey tournament that weekend. She was applying to the University of Calgary for environmental science. She had a best friend named Okafor who she'd known since grade 4. She had a life. A real, full, rooted life in my house in this town. I told Renee that Sophie wasn't going anywhere. The man in the dark coat spoke for the first time. He introduced himself as a family law attorney retained by my daughter. He said that Renee was Sophie's biological mother, that she had never formally relinquished parental rights, and that she was seeking to re-establish custody. He also said, and this is the part that knocked the air out of me, that they had concerns about the circumstances under which Sophie had been living in my home. I asked him what that meant. He said the word carefully, like he'd rehearsed it. He said there were questions about whether my original guardianship application had been fully transparent about the nature of Sophie's placement in my care. He used the phrase unauthorized retention of a minor. I stood in my own doorway in my own house and heard a man suggest that I had taken my granddaughter. I told them to leave. I closed the door. I stood in the hall with my back against it and I could hear my heart. Upstairs, Sophie called down, "Grandpa, who was at the door?" I told her it was nothing. A solicitor. I called Hugh that night. Hugh had since moved his practice to Calgary, but he remembered me. I explained what had happened. He went quiet in a way that told me this was serious. He said that because Renee had never formally terminated her parental rights, she retained standing to contest custody. He said that my guardianship was legal and valid, but that a determined lawyer with the right framing could complicate things. He said he would represent me, but that I should be prepared. I was not prepared for what came next. 2 weeks later, I received official documents. The filing accused me of having manipulated the original guardianship process by misrepresenting the circumstances of Sophie's placement. Specifically, that I had told Child and Family Services that Renee had abandoned Sophie when, the filing claimed, Renee had intended a temporary caregiving arrangement and had maintained contact throughout. This was a lie. An absolute, documented lie. But I also understood, sitting at my kitchen table reading those pages, that lies don't need to be true to do damage. I told Sophie that night. I sat her down in the living room and I told her everything as plainly as I could. Her mother had come back. There was a legal process happening. I was going to fight it. She had the right to know. Sophie sat very still while I talked. When I finished, she said, "Does she actually want me or does she want something else?" I didn't know how to answer that. I told her I wasn't sure. Sophie nodded slowly. Then she said, "I want to testify." I told her she didn't have to do that. She said, "I know I don't have to. I want to." She was 17. In Alberta, at 17, a judge will absolutely hear from a child directly about their own living situation. Hugh confirmed this. He said Sophie's testimony could be significant. I told him Sophie wanted to speak. He said to let her, but before we even got to court, things got worse. The lawyer, his name was Fenwick, I later found out. A man with offices in Calgary who specialized in what I can only describe as manufacturing family law complications, began contacting people from my community. He reached out to a former co-worker of mine, a man I had known for 12 years named Barry, who had held a grudge against me since a promotion I had received over him back in 2019. Barry agreed to provide a statement saying I had been controlling and secretive about Sophie's situation at work. He said I had discouraged people from asking about her mother. That was one statement. Fenwick also contacted the family across the street, the Doucets, who had moved in 3 years ago. I had not gotten along with them well. There was an ongoing disagreement about a fence line that had turned sour. Mrs. Doucet gave a statement suggesting she had seen Sophie appear distressed on multiple occasions and that I had seemed unwilling to discuss Sophie's family background. 2 statements from 2 people with reasons to dislike me. I felt the ground shifting. Hugh told me to document everything. I went through 14 years of records. Guardianship papers, school enrollment forms, medical records, Sophie had had her appendix out at 12 and I had sat in that hospital for 11 hours. Report cards, letters from teachers, photos. I had a box, an actual cardboard banker's box full of 14 years of a child's life. And there was one other thing. When Renee had left, she had sent me a letter. Not right away. About 8 months after she disappeared, I received an envelope with a Saskatchewan postmark. Inside was a single handwritten page. In it, she said she was sorry. She said she was not in a position to care for Sophie. She said she knew I would take good care of her daughter. She said she was signing over, her words, signing over Sophie's care to me, and that she did not expect to be in contact for some time. It was not a legal document, but it was in her handwriting, with her signature, and it said exactly what I have just told you. It said, I had kept it in a fireproof lockbox in my bedroom closet for 14 years. I had not thought about it in years, honestly. It was just there in the box, the way painful things sit quietly in the dark. My neighbor Art found out what was happening through the small town way that news travels. Someone told someone who told someone. Art came over one evening, stood in my kitchen, and asked me plainly what he could do. I told him about the letter. I told him it was in the lockbox. He asked me if Fenwick knew about it. I said I hadn't disclosed it yet. Hugh was building our disclosure package and the letter was going to be part of it. Art said, don't let that letter out of your sight. He was half joking, but he wasn't entirely. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the Court of King's Bench in Lethbridge. I arrived in a suit I'd worn to Margaret's funeral and had never worn since. Hugh was beside me. Sophie was there, calm in a way that made me proud and worried in equal measure. Renee sat across the room with Fenwick. She did not look at me when she came in. She looked at Sophie. Sophie looked back, and I could not read her expression. I have known that girl's face for 17 years, and in that moment I could not read it. Fenwick presented his case first. He spoke about Renee's transformation. Recovery, stability, a new home in Kelowna. A steady income. He presented her as a woman who had struggled but had never stopped being a mother. He was careful and practiced. And the way he framed things made me sound like a man who had quietly seized a child and isolated her from her mother. Then Hugh stood up. He walked the judge through the guardianship application from 2011. He presented the CFS approval. He presented 14 years of documentation, school records, medical files, the confirmation letters from Sophie's activities and programs, all of it organized and dated and real. He spoke about consistency, about stability, about what it means to raise a child. And then he presented the letter. Hugh handed a copy to the judge and a copy to Fenwick. Fenwick looked at it for a long moment. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted. The judge read the letter slowly. When he looked up, he looked at Renee. He said quietly, Ms. Mudd, Renee, did you write this? The room was very still. Renee's jaw tightened. She looked at Fenwick. Fenwick touched her arm, the small practiced gesture of a lawyer managing a client. She said, yes. The judge looked back at the letter. He said, and in this letter you describe your father as Sophie's caregiver and express your intent to leave her in his care. Is that accurate? A longer pause. Yes. The judge set the letter down. He looked at Fenwick. He said, Counsel, I'd like to understand how the allegation of unauthorized retention is consistent with this document. Fenwick began to speak. He used words like contextual and informal and subsequent circumstances. The judge let him speak. Then the judge asked Hugh a question. Then the judge asked Sophie to speak. Sophie stood up. She was 17 years old and she stood in a courtroom and she spoke about her life clearly and without trauma. She said she knew her grandfather had raised her. She said she had been aware for years that her mother was absent. She said she did not hold bitterness. She said that quietly, and I believed her. But she said that her home was in Lethbridge with her grandfather, and that she intended to go to the University of Calgary in September, and that she was asking the court to allow her to finish growing up in the home where she had always been. She sat back down. I put my hand over hers under the table. The judge recessed for 20 minutes. When he came back, he ruled. He dismissed Renee's custody claim. He cited the letter. He cited the Sophie's age and clearly expressed wishes. He cited the 14 years of documented stable caregiving. He noted pointedly that the characterization of my guardianship as unauthorized retention was not supported by the evidence before the court, and that the original placement had been handled through proper provincial channels. He also noted, in language that was measured but unmistakable, that the statements provided by Mr. Barry and Mrs. Doucette were of limited credibility given their acknowledged personal conflicts with me and their lack of direct knowledge about Sophie's home life. Fenwick gathered his papers. Renee sat for a moment, not moving. Then she stood. As she turned to leave, she looked at me for the first time since she had knocked on my door 6 weeks ago. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Art was waiting outside the courthouse. He asked how it went. I told him we won. He clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Of course you did. You had the truth." It sounds simple when he says it like that. The truth. As if the truth is always enough. In this case, it was. In this case, 14 years of showing up and one letter in a fireproof box were enough. That evening, Sophie and I drove to a diner on the edge of town that we have gone to since she was small. We ordered the same things we always order. She got the grilled cheese. I got the soup. We didn't talk about the court much. She asked me if I was okay. I told her I was. She told me she had meant everything she said in there. I told her I knew. She starts at U of C in September. Environmental science with a focus on prairie wetlands. She wants to work on conservation policy eventually. She has already been in contact with a professor there whose research she's been following since she was 15. I drove back to Lethbridge from Calgary after helping her move into her residence. The drive is about 2 hours on a clear day. I put on the radio and I let the flat land go by, and I thought about Margaret, who would have loved to see this, and about the driveway out front where a little girl with a polar bear on her pajamas once asked me where her mama had gone. I told her a trip, that she would be back soon. It took 14 years in a courtroom, but I kept her safe until she was ready to go on her own terms. That was always the job. I just didn't know it at the time. I know it now. I keep thinking about that lockbox. It sat in my bedroom closet for 14 years. I didn't open it often. There was a copy of Margaret's will in there, some old insurance papers, Sophie's original birth certificate, and the letter. I put the letter in there the week it arrived, and I didn't take it out again until Hugh asked me to pull together every document I had. I don't think I kept it because I was strategic. I kept it because throwing it away felt wrong. It was proof that something had happened, even if I never planned to use it as proof. Maybe that's what doing the right thing actually looks like most of the time. Not dramatic, not calculated, just quietly choosing not to destroy the record of the truth. Renee made the opposite choice. She chose to rewrite the story of those 14 years into something that suited her. And I understand at some level that people do that. Not evil people necessarily, just people who have spent long enough running from something that they've started to believe their own version of it. But what she didn't account for was that I had been living the real version, one day at a time, and I had kept the receipts. Every school form, every doctor's visit, every hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning. When you actually do the work, the evidence accumulates on its own. Sophie standing up in that courtroom. That was not something I coached her to do. I told her she didn't have to. She said she wanted to. There is something in that I think about a great deal. She was 17 years old, and she had every reason to feel confused or bitter or pulled in two directions. Instead, she was clear. She knew what was true, and she was willing to say it out loud in front of a judge. Where does that come from in a person? I'd like to think some of it came from watching me. From growing up in a house where we called things what they were, and we didn't look away from hard conversations. But a lot of it was just her. Her own sense of what was right. Her own ability to think through a situation and speak honestly about it, even when it cost her something. I'm not a perfect man. I made mistakes raising her, the way every parent does. I was too strict about some things, and probably not strict enough about others. There were years when I was tired in a bone-deep way that I didn't fully acknowledge. But I showed up. Every single day I showed up. And I think that consistency, that refusal to quit on someone even when it was hard and unglamorous and no one was watching, is what made the difference in the end. Not a grand gesture, just 14 years of ordinary mornings. Art said, "You had the truth." And he was right. But I'd add something to that. You have to be the kind of person who holds on to the truth even when it's inconvenient, even when no one's asking for it. even when it's just sitting in a lockbox in a closet gathering dust. Because you don't always know when you need it. You just know that letting it go would make you someone you don't want to be. Sophie sends me photos from campus. Last week, she sent one of herself standing in a wetland preserve outside the city, rubber boots on, grinning. She looked like someone who knows exactly where she belongs. That's what I was keeping her safe for. Not to win a court case. Just for that.